I'm the chair of the Orange County Cousins Club, Americans for Peace in Israel, Palestine. Our topic is the road to peace. One state, two states, or a confederation. We have four distinguished speakers up here in front who will each have 15 minutes to address this topic, and we'll then have a brief time for a Q&A, questions and answers from the audience. I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists and the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker on the left here is Barry Steiner, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Cal State Long Beach, and he is going to advocate a two-state solution. He recently published a book entitled New Issues in Mediating the Israel-Palestine Deadlock. Next, we're going to hear from Miko Peled. He is a human rights activist who grew up in Jerusalem, and he advocates a one-state solution. And he has two books here that he has authored. One is called The General Son, and the other one, Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation Plot. Our third speaker, sitting over there, is Nabil Dajani. He is the co-chair of the Cousins Club with me, and he favors a one-state solution also. Nabil is a Palestinian whose family lost everything in 1948 and moved to Egypt. Last but not least, over here, is attorney Josef Avesar, who has produced a film entitled Surviving Peace, which calls for a confederation.
First of all, I would like to thank the Cousins Club for arranging this debate on a subject that is very, very dear to my heart. The problem is from a two-state solution point of view, is that the Israelis and the Palestinians are very far from a two-state solution. But they created in the 1990s structures and a process to reach a two-state solution. The two-state advocate is a very frustrated person, but I gather many of the people on this panel are just as frustrated as I am. This is a way of trying to release our frustration and talking about the issue and learning from each other. The way to talk about the two-state solution idea is to have in mind the Oslo Accords, which were in two stages in the 1990s. This goes back quite a ways, and I'm just going to summarize what they brought about. Oslo I, the first Oslo agreement, made famous by the handshake with Mr. Rabin and Mr. Arafat with President Clinton outside the White House in 1993, was a declaration of principles establishing an elected Palestinian government, governing authority, governing council, and authorizing the start of permanent status negotiations. Oslo II in 1995 was even more important. That was an interim peace agreement. The agreement specified that the Palestinian Authority would share control of 40% of the West Bank as part of what was called a haphazard distribution of Palestine and Israel enclaves, bypass roads, and disconnected territories. The map is very crazy oriented, but it does provide for a substantial Palestinian self-governing area in the West Bank, first of all. Second, Israel recognized in Oslo II Palestinian water rights in the Palestinian areas, demonstrating that where competition for a resource is intense, the two sides can cooperate. And third, and perhaps most important, security cooperation was established between Israel and Palestine under U.S. auspices, proving that the two sides could cooperate on a common interest. These aspects show diplomatic potential. Now what's required to get the two-state solution is a greater actualization of that potential, of that process that was created in the 1990s and has been relatively stagnant since that time. What's important to understand is the Oslo II terms, which I just recited to you, remain in effect today. And to gauge their importance, you have to imagine, you have to do the counterfactual, what would happen if they did not exist, if there were no Palestinian Authority, if there were no security cooperation between Israel and Palestine, if there were no cooperation on water rights. If those conditions prevail, Israel's military government and civil administration would have to directly rule Palestinians, which would be a much more volatile condition than is the present status quo. The problem is, one of the problems is that this longevity of Oslo II is one of the best kept secrets in the Middle East. It's hidden because leaders ignore it while they critique each other's legitimacy. There's no public credit given for Oslo II terms, even though they remain in effect. That is one of the consequences of this Palestine-Israel Cold War, which has now existed for a number of years. The Israelis say, we have no partner for peace. Violence between Israel and Israeli forces and Gaza inhabitants, which have been frequent in the last year, convince Israelis that the Palestinians don't want peace. And in Israel, to talk about peace is considered naive or dangerous. And then Israel also finally benefits from the division between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas leaders in Gaza. So the credit, the importance of Oslo II is really ignored unfairly. But it still exists, and it did not exist, the two sides would be in worse situations than they are today. Why are they not discussed? Because it suits the Israelis and the Palestinian leaders to have a stalemate. Analysts call it a soft stalemate because it is tolerable and stable and avoids the uncertainties of negotiating for something better than with the opposing side, who is very much mistrusted. But this is where Oslo II engages my ambivalence. Oslo II is part of the explanation for the failure to negotiate a two-state solution. Each side can rely on Oslo II. Neither needs to know the will, to show the will to gain something better. Now that's all part of the problem. The solution has to be American mediation, which is a very difficult role, a very difficult assignment. I think it's fair to say that if you look at American foreign policy in the post-war period, nothing has been more frustrating to the United States than its interest in mediating Israel and Palestine conflict. Even Mr. Trump has gotten engaged in this matter. We don't really know what his plan is, but apparently there is a plan. Now, to understand the mediation problem, I can only begin to talk about it. It's a very big topic. It has to be understood that mediation is an uphill battle. Most diplomacy is uphill. Harold Saunders, who was a well-known and very highly respected State Department negotiator, is said to have told his staff that our job is to take a 10% chance of success, try to turn it into a 20% chance, and hope for a break. That's diplomacy from him. Now, you might say, well, what kind of chance does that suggest? There's a risk of failure. But if there's a strong will, if there's a purpose, then governments will do it. And the United States, frankly, has been in that position often in the post-war period. One of the problems that Saunders is talking about is that mediation is likely to offend both sides. Neither side really wants mediation. But mediation, the argument is, it's good for them because a two-state solution is in the interest of both sides. The second point I want to make is, and here's where my own work comes in, the best planning for mediation entails the following assumption. Assume that the president gives authority for the strongest mediating intervention in the Palestine question. Suppose the president says go all out to gain a two-state solution. The question is, how should the United States behave? What kind of policy initiatives should it champion? I have some views about that, which I can talk about later. I wrote an essay saying that the thing that the United States should do, the best thing it could do, is outright recognize the Palestinian Authority as a state, as the leadership of a state. But the main point I want to make is there has to be planning for it. It can't just happen. One has to prepare for the consequences and the problems and attempt to overcome them. And just to talk about one problem in mediation, I'm referring to Thomas Friedman. He says, America risks loving Israel to death It's the threat that America will love Israel to death that is Israel's main problem. Because the United States indulges Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in his quest for permanent Israeli control of the West Bank. Trump, Congress, and the Israel lobby are going to create a situation whereby the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank will eventually collapse, which is could be a big that could really undermine Oslo big time. I think one continuing problem with American mediation is that it has been too partial to Israel as a consequence of what has been a long-term Israel-American alliance. And so the question is, how do you maintain the alliance while pushing both sides to a mediated settlement that they might not like? Thank you very much.
Conversation. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ruth, for putting it together, and the Cousins Club. I'm happy to see that Nabil is on the panel. After all, Palestinians make up the majority of the population in Palestine, so they should have at least a 25% representation on the panel. That seems to be kind of the way it is. So I think that a big piece of this puzzle, a big piece of this conversation that is often missing from the conversation is the fact that a single state in Palestine is already a reality. A single state in Palestine is not something that is a choice. It's not something that may or may not happen. It's not something that we're going to sit and negotiate about. Israel established a single state over all of Palestine. It's called Israel. Israel controls the lives of every single person that lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, or historic Palestine. And it denies or banned the Palestinians who are refugees from ever returning, and some of them are sitting here today. So there is a single state. Now, it wasn't a mistake. It didn't just happen overnight. This was a well thought out plan to create a state of Israel in what they call the land of Israel, which is all of Palestine. So we're already there. A single state exists. It's an apartheid state. Why is it an apartheid state? Because when I lived there, and my family, the way my family lives, we live under a certain set of laws that are pretty liberal and democratic. The way Palestinians live is completely different. They live under a completely different set of laws and rules which govern their day-to-day life. And among the Palestinians, there are differences too, depending specifically on where they live. So some Palestinians have, and I'm sure many of you know this, some Palestinians have kind of a quasi-citizenship. Others have what they call a alien residence. These are the Jerusalemite Palestinians whose families have been there since the days of Salah sometimes. And then you've got the Palestinians who live in these two areas, one which used to be called the West Bank. There's no more West Bank, by the way. It's Judea and Samaria. And the ones who live in the Gaza Strip. And then there's a whole other group of Palestinians who live in refugee camps and have, no ID at all, no identity at all as Palestinians. So that is the reality. There is a single state. It was created by Israel. That's the reality. The question that we face is, I believe, whether that state should be allowed to continue, whether that state has a right to exist, a racist apartheid state, or whether we should engage in changing it into a democracy. So it's not one state, two state, three states. It is a free Palestine or an apartheid Palestine, which is what they call Israel. Now, the biggest question that people don't want to touch is, does Israel have a right to exist? And the answer should be categorically no. Israel has no right to exist. It is a state that from the very beginning was established as a result of genocide and ethnic cleansing, after which they imposed an apartheid regime on Palestine. Now, in the beginning, it only included 80% of Palestine. After 1967, it included all of Palestine. So that's the reality. Did apartheid South Africa have a right to exist? I suppose that's depends on our values. Some people think it's okay for white people to have privilege and dark people to have no rights. A lot of people in this country think that way, and the reality in this country is still like that, actually. That hasn't really changed much. And the alliance between Israel, they talk about shared values between Israel and the United States. Well, these are the shared values. Racism, genocide, and the rights of white Europeans to live at the expense of local indigenous people who are not white and not European. So this is really the question. And it's not a political question, although I believe the solution is a political solution. It's not a religious question. It's a question of values. Do we believe that a state that still engages in genocide and ethnic cleansing today, 71 years after it was established, and has imposed an apartheid regime, a vicious apartheid regime, denies Palestinians water, denies them access to medical care? And I'm not only talking about Palestinians in Gaza, I'm talking about Palestinians who have supposedly the same Israeli citizenship that I have. Palestinians are being accused now, as we speak, of stealing water and stealing land, encroaching upon lands that belong to the Jews. The Nakab Desert, which makes up about half of Palestine. 200,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel that are denied water. Palestinian children in the Nakab every summer suffer from intestinal diseases that I didn't even know existed, because I always had as much water as I wanted. But they live in towns that are called unrecognized towns, towns that predated the state of Israel, and they refuse to be removed. So they get no water, no electricity, no education, no health care, no roads. So if there's an emergency, there's no way for an ambulance to get there. These are Israeli citizens. In the Gaza Strip, in what used to be called the West Bank, which is now Judea and Samaria, it's even worse. When you drive along the highways in what they call Israel proper, I don't know why it's called proper, but they consider Israel in the pre-1967 borders as proper. When you drive along the highway, you'll see on the one side the Palestinian towns, on the other side you'll see the Israeli settlements. And by the way, all Israeli towns and all Israeli cities are settlements, illegal settlements. And all us Israelis are settlers. Right. Now, on the Palestinian homes, you're going to see these big black tankers, water tanks. You don't see them on any Israeli towns, on the Israeli homes. And we're talking across the street. Why do you not see them on the one side and you see them only on the Palestinian side? Because the Palestinians do not have a regular supply of water, so they need these big water tanks. And Israelis like me wouldn't imagine not going to the sink and tap and having clean water. So again, it's not a question. One state, two states. The idea that the Zionist state, the state of Israel, that any kind of government within the state of Israel will allow Palestinian rights of in any way, shape, or form, it's not fiction, it's science fiction. Look at the history of Zionism. We have a history now that predates the state of Israel, and then from the day the state of Israel was established. It is one long, depressing history of oppression, of genocide, and of ethnic cleansing. And it hasn't stopped for 1 second over the last 71 years. And it will not stop as long as the state of Israel exists. So it doesn't matter whether Palestinians live here, there, or somewhere else. They are all denied rights. The existence of a Jewish state anywhere in Palestine cannot but come at the expense of Palestinian rights. And any existence of a Zionist state, the state of Israel, in any way, in any form, in any shape, will always deny Palestinian rights. Benjamin Netanyahu is the absolute natural successor of every single Israeli prime minister that came before him. He just nominated two of the most racist, fanatic, religious figures within the Israeli political system into the cabinet, into the security cabinet within the cabinet. One is a rabbi called Rafi Peled, and the other one is Bezalel Smotrich. These are settlers of the worst, most fanatic kind that live within the West Bank. They were raised upon the belief that the Jews are the masters and the Palestinians should be slaves and should be kicked out. And they will do everything they can until they kick every Palestinian out and build a temple instead of Al-Aqsa Mosque and instead of the Golden Dome, the Dome of the Rock. That is where it's going. It's happening in Jerusalem, it's happening in Hebron, it's happening in the Negev, it's happening in Jaffa, it's happening in the Galilee, it's happening everywhere all the time. Now, I go back to our values. Do we believe a state like that has a right to exist? And when we say no, those of us that say no, they come back and they say, see, you want to kill all the Jews. Well, opposing apartheid did not mean killing all the whites in South Africa, right? We Israelis were like the whites in South Africa. We don't belong there, we're not from there, we're the result of settler colonialism and racism. But we're part of the scenery now. There's this new creation called the people of Israelis. That's a new creation. The idea that Jews have a right to self-determination in Palestine is absurd. Israelis are there. That's the reality. That's the reality that has to be there. But they cannot live there. They cannot have a right to live there at the expense of somebody else. They do not have a right to live there as privileged people. So, when I wear this button, and I see many of you already have, and there's more if you'd like them, the point is very simple. Democracy, freedom, justice. Those are the deal. Those are the three conditions. And until such a time that these conditions are met, the state of Israel has no right to exist. And when these conditions are met, then obviously we're going to have a democracy with equal rights and allowing for the return of the refugees to their homes and their lands. That will be the beginning, not the end, but the beginning of a reality in which Israelis and Palestinians can start solving the problems that they have. But until such time as a real democracy with equal rights, that is not a Zionist state, it's a state of the people who live there. One person, one vote. Until that day, until that state exists, then boycott, divestment, and sanctions must be upheld. And there will not be an end to the Palestinian suffering. The only way the Palestinian suffering can end is when the state of Israel is transformed to a real democracy with equal rights. So it's not about this state or that state or one state or two states. It's a single state already. It's done. Now, do we fight for democracy and the rights of Palestinians and for justice? Or do we to allow it to continue? That, I believe, is the question. Thank you.
I always wonder, we have been fighting for the last 100 years. And I wonder for how long we will continue fighting each other. And we started really with Balfour Declaration in 1917, where Lord Balfour, the foreign minister of England, gave Rothschild family a letter saying that the Balfour Declaration which states that England will look with favor for establishing a Jewish home in Palestine, provided it does not, and I will read it here. His Majesty government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavor to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existence of non-Jewish community in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. So, when the Jewish immigration started coming in, they were like colonial settlers, just like the whites came here to America and exterminated the Native Americans, or in South Africa, or in New Zealand, or in Australia. And they were saying, this country is going to be Jewish, just like England is English, and France is French. This is going to be a Jewish country. So if you're not a Jew, we are going to kick you out. And that's where it started, the conflict. And in 1948, and the Palestinians look at the Zionists as a colonial settlers, and not as people coming to live with them, because Armenians were massacred by Turkey in the First World War, and they came to live with the Arab countries, and they lived with us and among us up till now. As a matter of fact, the PLO representative in England is Armenian, of Armenian origin. So 1948, and United Nations partition took place, and Israel was able to take the majority of the land until 1967, war. Israel took over the West Bank, Sinai, Golan Heights, not in 6 days, in 6 minutes. They were so powerful and strong. The Palestinians formed the PLO, hoping, and their motto, and I know in Arabic, is Harakat Tahrir, maybe you understand, right? You understand Arabic, right? It's a Harakat Tahrir Palestine, but if you have it, the letters HTF, it means throw, and they didn't want to mean throw away. So they made it Fatah, F, Palestinian Tahrir Harakat. So just to show their good intentions. However, you know, the Palestinians in those days, there was Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, all these liberal movements all over the world, in Africa and Kenya and in South America and in Asia. And so they will do the same, will just go and fight like they did. But they didn't work out for many reasons. In 1982, they were defeated in Lebanon, and they had to leave Lebanon to Tunisia. In 1993, they made the Oslo Accord. And really, I was listening to Ilan Pape, who is an Israeli historian. Yesterday, he was saying that he read the records of the Israeli government that were secrets, but they are not anymore secrets. That after the '67 war, all the Israeli governments and everybody was represented what they are going to do with the West Bank. And they all decided they are going to keep the West Bank. They are not going to give it up. Even Shamir, later in the year, said, I'm going to keep on negotiating with the Palestinians for 100 years and not give them anything. So now the composition of Israel has changed. it became a right-wing religious country. Not all of Israel, but well-organized groups. They are well-organized, they are strong, they are active, and they took over the power in Israel, up till now. I want to remind you there are peace movements in Israel. And one that I know personally is Nabil or Wahat al-Salam, where Jews or Israelis and Palestinians are living in the same village, sharing everything and succeeding. So there are many Israelis, but they are not organized according to Ilan Pape, or to be strong enough to be elected in the government. Not only Palestinians are faced with Israeli right wing, they are faced with American right wing, especially Christian Zionists. And not only Christian Zionists, we have a group called neocons, and also Fox News. And these are very powerful, because I know many guys you talk to, oh, I listen to Fox News, they even repeat word for word what Fox News says. So, what's the end for the Palestinians? What are we going to do? And this is my theory, and I hope somebody will agree with me, that Palestinians don't have anybody else. Our Arab friends, Egypt and Jordan, made peace with Israel. Our rich Arabs are now in bed with Israel, and we are left with the broke one who don't have money or have power. So we have to have a new way of fighting Israel. And my new way of fighting Israel is peaceful resistance, non-violent resistance. And Palestinians have to open communications with the Israeli community. They can find one, we have to look for it, and start dialogue with the Palestinian community. Support BDS, which is boycott, divestments, what's that? Sanctions. It's called age. And Palestinians to get more organized and be more economically dependent, because they cannot depend on Saudi Arabia or United States for the same. So they have to form their own economy. And they have to support education and make sure women get the best education, because women are half the population, and they raise their children to be better citizens. And they have to be activists. So I hope, this is my theory, I mean, we cannot go on fighting for the next 100 years or 200 years. We have to find a solution, and Arabs and Jews are smart enough, right, Miko? You agree with me? We are smart enough that we can find a solution to solve our problems. Now, on the Israeli side, Israel was created because of anti-Semitism in Europe and United States, especially in Europe and United States. I mean, there is not too many Jews in Asia or Africa. But nowadays, anti-Semitism is almost doesn't exist. It exists, but not that much. And Jews are respected and loved by many people. So they don't have the desire or what the other founding fathers have. And I hate it when I see Jewish settlers with guns on their shoulders, going to Palestinian villages and kicking Palestinians out of their homes. And it reminds me of the Wild West with the cowboys going after the Native Americans. And of course, we saw Native Americans as the ones to be blamed. So Israel has to change and not become any more Zionist as it is now. Just like Africa, South Africa is not apartheid anymore. And I'm open if anybody has more suggestions to tell me and how we can make this possible. So I just want to mention, I mentioned Ilan Pappé, but I also want to mention another Israeli, and I know there are many other Israelis, called Harakabi, who was chief of military intelligence. Yeah,
He died.
he died.
Yeah, okay.
And if you read Harakabi's book, Israel Faithful Hour, it shows you how the right wing in Israel, how religious they are becoming, that it's scary. It will affect the democracy. And also among the Palestinians, we have Professor Steiner, Edward Said, and Hanan Ashrawi are very powerful. They are all professors at universities and have a lot of influence. Both Sayer and Edward Said passed away. So anyway, so this is my contribution.
So, my name is Josef Avesar, and I'm here to tell you why I think a confederation, an Israeli-Palestinian confederation, is really the only way to make peace. It's the best way. It makes the most sense under the circumstances. And in my opinion, it will be a game changer when we get it implemented. Let me start with the two-state solution. In 1947, 72 years ago, the United Nations voted on a two-state solution. One state for the Jews, one state for the Palestinians. Since then, we had the most influential, the best political brains, presidents, prime ministers, senators, governments, meetings upon meetings, millions of dollars spent on creating a two-state solution. And guess what happened? They made it worse. They made it a lot worse than what it was in 1947. So for the life of me, I don't understand why would we even advocate a two-state solution. It's not a formula for peace. It's segregation. It's basically telling people, you'll be on that side of the wall, and you'll be on that side of the wall based on your religion. Now, we are in America, we don't like segregation. So why would we advocate segregation for them when it's anathema to ourselves? It makes no sense. It makes no sense that a person will have to, before he used to go and visit his father, his mother, 50 feet away. Now he has to travel miles and miles, and believe me, I did it. And present your passport to go to the other side to visit your family. Doesn't make sense. It's not a peaceful solution. It's opposite of peace. But I'm not gonna spend much time on it because 72 years it's been proven that it's not gonna happen. It's really not a solution that will happen. Now, with regard to the one state, I agree. One state makes a lot of sense. One government for the people of Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. One person, one vote, a secular government makes a lot of sense. No person in his right mind who supports a democracy would be in opposition to that. However, we happen to have 3 governments in that area right now. And these 3 governments have been entrenching more and more and more. We have a very strong and very nationalistic Israeli government. We have a very strong and very nationalistic Hamas government, and we have a very strong and very nationalistic PA. In order to have one state, you need to have one government. In order to have one government, you need to dismantle the very strong and nationalistic Israeli government, Palestinian government, and Hamas government. They're not going to let it happen. They're not. The moment you tell these governments, we want to dismantle you, and we want to create one government for everyone, you are their enemy. They're just going to be more entrenched. It makes no practical sense, even though it does make theoretical sense. I agree. Secular government for everyone does make theoretical sense, but it's not practical. We have the state of Wyoming with 600,000 people under the same federal government as the state of California with 39 million people. Why? Because we were able to come up with a win-win solution. They will have 2 senators, we will have 2 senators, but we will have 39 congressmen, they have 1 congressman. So we create a win-win situation based on the circumstances. A democracy is never an ideal situation. Ideally, yes, you want to have one government for everyone, but it's not possible because people do not want to give up their power. And the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, the Hamas government, they're not going to give up their power. And if you speak of one state, you have to say, how is it that you intend to get those governments dismantled? And I don't think, I never really heard anybody explain that. So, this is what I believe in. I believe in creating a 3rd independent government for the people of Israel and Palestine together. A separate government. Separate from whom? Separate from the Israeli government, separate from the Palestinian government. A independent government. Independent of whom? Independent of the Israeli government, independent of the Palestinian government. A government that will be created by the people of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, regardless of the Israeli government, regardless of the Palestinian government, because those governments are the least capable of making peace. So you want to create a government for the entire area exclusively for the purpose of making peace. And how do you make that happen? And by the way, you can create the election today in a year from now. Not 50 years from now, a year from now, we can have the election on the internet with people from Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. The election can take a month, 2 or 3 months, and we will elect 300 parliament members. What does that mean? We will take the whole area of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, divide it into 300 parliamentary districts. Each district will elect 1 person. The district could be Israeli exclusively, it could be Palestinian, or it could be both Israeli and Palestinian. They will each elect one person. That person could be Israeli, that person could be Palestinian. So if you have an area that is both Israeli and Palestinian, you elect whoever you believe will represent your opinion. Eventually you'll end up with 300 parliament members. You will also elect a president and vice president. The president will be the person who gets the most votes. The vice president will be the person who gets the second amount of votes of the other nationality, and they will rotate after 2 years. Now, what's the purpose of this government? Purpose of this government is to make peace. It will have an overall view. It will represent the approximately 14 million people that are there, Israelis and Palestinians. And in order for them to pass legislation, you will need 55% of the Palestinian parliament members and 55% of the Israeli parliament members to vote yes. So if we have 160 Palestinian members and we have 140 Israeli members, you'll need 55% of the 160 and 55% of the 140 to vote yes on the legislation. Then you would go to the Israeli government, Palestinian government, the Israeli Knesset, which is the legislative branch, and the Palestinian parliament, and you say, here, we voted on a law, and we are giving you the opportunity to veto the legislation. If any one of you veto the legislation, it's not going to become law. But if you do not veto the legislation, it will be the law. So now you're thinking, Joseph, they will veto every legislation. And my question to you is this. Well, actually, my comment to you is this. They wouldn't be able to veto every legislation. And let me give you an example. For years, the Israeli government, if you ask the Israeli prime minister or the Palestinian president, why is there no peace? 72 years they haven't been able to make peace. They're going to tell you almost the same thing. The reason we don't have peace is because the other side teaches hate towards us. If they stop teaching their children to hate us, we will have peace. Fine. So the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation passes legislation which says each side is required to teach tolerance towards the other side. At this time, once this legislation passes, no Israeli government, no Palestinian government will be able to veto the legislation. There are more. What is really the central issue of the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Two major issues, the refugees and the occupation. If these two issues are solved, there is a good chance that the entire conflict is solved. Up to now, the Israeli government and the Palestinian government were never able to solve that issue. Not only were they not able to solve it, they did not even touch upon it. They never offered anything of significance to their people regarding those issues to solve them. So here comes the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation and says, okay, we're going to give the refugees an option. And we are going to discuss, just like when you do legislation, you discuss with governments and you discuss with governments all over the world, and you finally come up with a formula. And you say the formula is, it's a possibility that they'll do that. The formula is that we will have a right of return and compensation to the Palestinian refugees. A combination of a right of return and compensation. The Israeli government may or may not be able to veto it. We actually had a mock Israeli-Palestinian Confederation legislation years ago on Facebook. And the Israeli Prime Minister had a very hard time vetoing this legislation. And the reason is because he was faced with the question, what else do you have for peace? And he couldn't really come up with it. So there is a good possibility that with enough world pressure and enough internal pressure, both the Israeli and the Palestinian governments will not be able to veto this legislation. The other thing that the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation could do is create a common, mutual, Israeli and Palestinian security force. The security force could replace the Israeli soldiers. It could allow access to both Jews and Muslims into their holy sites in Jerusalem, and it can remove all the checkpoints. It can also create a mutual economic zone. So if you think, what I'm trying to say is that the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation does not have to accept the Israeli narrative or the Palestinian narrative. It can come up with its own narrative for peace. And I think that the reason it is such a reasonable solution is because not only is it practical, but it is possible. It is possible because neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian government will be able to oppose it. So, thank you so much. I know my time is up.
So, of course, there are Israeli settlements that have been built, and the number of Israelis in them has grown greatly. However, as I understand it, the territorial aspects of a two-state settlement have just about been worked out already. In other words, Mr. Abbas, the Palestinian leader, and Mr. Olmert, the Israeli leader, some years ago, negotiated together. And my understanding, as it was reported, the territorial aspects were hardly in conflict. There were a couple of settlements about which they did not agree. So they were not completely in agreement. But to say that territory is going to hold back a settlement, it seems to me, is a mistake. What's holding back a settlement is the will to have a two-state solution. It's not the substance of what needs to be negotiated. And the problem of the will to agree is a problem on both sides.
I think that's exactly what we're doing. When we put on the button that says boycott, divestment, and sanctions, first of all, the demand for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a Palestinian demand. So, for once, we're not the people on the outside telling the oppressed how they need to oppose the oppression. We are supporting their call. Now, the demands of the BDS call are very clear. Ending the occupation, equal rights, and the right of return. That's exactly what we're talking about. That's exactly what we're talking about. The inevitable result of justice is a single democracy over all of historic Palestine. That's the logical, natural consequence once these three demands are met. That's what's going to happen. So it's not about imposing anything on anybody. It's imposing justice and equal rights and the right of return on a racist settler colonial society which has taken over Palestine. That's going to be the imposition. It's not imposing anything on Palestinians. The thing is, we're trying to impose this on these. That's the whole idea of BDS, to bring down the apartheid regime and replace it with democracy. It's not about imposing, and you're right, that's exactly what we should be advocating. Every single member of Congress who does not vote for Betty McCollum's bill
Right.
against the, supporting the Palestinian child citizen, should get a phone call, should not be reelected. Any member of Congress that did not support boycotting Israel should not be reelected. Any member of Congress, city mayor, city council member, police chief that goes on these junkets to Israel should be kicked out of office. That's the reality we want to see here. But the thing is, the U.S. stands with Israel anyway. I mean, the deal of the century is a complete Palestinian capitulation and a complete victory for Israel. That's what the deal of the century is. And we've seen that with the closure of the Palestinian mission in DC on the day almost of the anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accord. That was not by mistake. We see the moving and the recognition of Jerusalem as a capital city. That's another piece of the deal of the century. We see the recognition of Israeli sovereignty on the Syrian Golan Heights. That's another step. And the next one's going to be Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, or Area C, which is exactly what they're talking about right now. You should all look up Betty McCollum and her bill that talks about ending 2407. 2407. HR 2407. It's a bill that calls on the Secretary of State to make sure that American funds do not go to facilities where Israel detains and tortures children. Now, the reason this bill is so good is because it details exactly the way Israel treats Palestinian children when they are detained and tortured. And that's precisely why there's not a Jewish caucus, but the Jewish members of Congress are not even willing to come close to this, okay? So that is a bill that every member of Congress should support, and any member of Congress who does not support should be outed and should be shamed, because we're talking about the detention and torture of thousands of children over years. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing is there are countless of opportunities to make sure that your city council members, that your mayor, that your chief of police, very local, do not go on junkets to Israel. And if they do, they should be outed, and they should be protesting outside their offices and so on. So there's lots that can be done on a very local level. Plus, again, like I said again, the Betty McCollum bill, plus walking around explaining to people why boycotting Israel is not only not anti-Semitic, it is absolutely the right thing to do and supported by many Jews. So these are many things that everybody can do every single day. And you get together, you talk to your friends, you call your elected representatives, and you go from there. There's lots of things, and that's exactly how it's done.
Very good questions. First of all, with regard to your vision, you said you do not see that vision happening. I agree. Probably 80% of Palestinians and 80% of Israelis do not see that vision happening. When democracy was created, probably 95% of the people who were ruled by the king and the queen did not see that happening. But we are not limited by one person's vision or lack of vision. We are looking at experience, and experience is to create democracy. And democracy is not about one person here or one person there. Democracy is a government for everyone. And what I believe, and what we believe, our organization believes, is that there are enough Israelis and enough Palestinians who are tired of this conflict, who know that their governments are not able to deliver peace, and therefore they are looking for an alternative solution. And that could be a very reasonable alternative solution, because guess what? They don't want to die. Now, with regard to who will decide the right of return, it's not going to be me. It's going to be the 300 parliament members. They will discuss, they will go back and forth, they will fight, they will go to the other governments, and they will try to come up with a formula that neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian government will be able to oppose. And guess what? It's not going to be a mandatory, it's going to be an option. It's going to be an option for the Palestinian. Here, you could be compensated $2 million for your pain and suffering. You have an option. The Israeli Palestinian Confederation was able to allocate $100 billion from all over the world. And we are willing to compensate you $2 million. You have the option to reject it. And you have the option to accept it. Guess what? Israeli Jews got compensation from the Germans. But let's assume that the Palestinians will be given an option by the Confederation. And neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian government was able to give any options for 72 years to the Palestinian refugees. Because we are talking about the whole area. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation is not only Israel, it's not only Gaza, it's not only the West Bank, the whole area. It's a big area. So they will decide, they will sit down and negotiate face to face like human beings and say, okay, we will return so many here, we will allow so many millions of people, more millions or more money to those who don't want to return, or whatever. But you work out an option. That's all we are talking about, an option.
The conflict between the settlers, the Jewish settlers, and the Palestinians who live in close proximity to each other is a very volatile question. There have been outbreaks of violence, and I'm really worried that there may be more violence.
They're in a cabinet.
And yes, maybe there are racists in the cabinet.
No, not racist. There are settlers in the cabinet.
There are
These settlers are in the
There are
cabinet.
settlers in the cabinet. For all those reasons, I think what has to be done as a matter of, as an imperative, is to separate Palestinians in the West Bank from the settlers and create a Palestinian state, right? I mean, Israel is an unnatural state in the sense that it is governing people that don't want to be governed by Israel. There's no question but that Palestinians want to be relieved of Israeli governance. And in answer to Joseph, the nationalism is just too strong to keep these two peoples together.
Number one, Israel is not a state, it's a regime. An ugly name, they use the name Israel to cover up the fact that it's an apartheid regime. So that regime has no right to exist and must be brought down. Two terms we have to, I think, refrain from using. One is peace and the other one is conflict. Because this is not a conflict and peace will not resolve it. This is an aggressive campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing. This is a regime of apartheid. There's no negotiating with these sorts of regimes. They have to be brought down. That's precisely what BDS is about. BDS in South Africa was designed to bring down the apartheid regime. No compromises, done. If Mandela wanted to compromise, he would have been out of jail way before 28 years had lapsed. That is really, really important. It's not about peace, it's about justice. It's not about negotiating, it's about boycotting and bringing Israel to its knees. Now, is that going to happen? Is that realistic? It depends on us. If that ever happens, it only depends on us. It might never happen. It might happen in a year or 2 years. It depends on how quickly we act. If we sat here today, if today was 1988, and we were talking about South Africa, and somebody would suggest that within 6 years, Nelson Mandela was going to be president of South Africa, they'd be laughed out of the room. Okay, in 1994, Mandela was already president of South Africa and apartheid regime fell. That's how we need to look at it. It's up to us. It's not going to be miraculous. Now, where do the refugees return to is an excellent question. How much are they going to be compensated is an excellent question because Palestine is not the same as it was in 1948. There are airports and highways and roads and cities. These are important issues that have to be, but none of this will be resolved. None of the water issues will be resolved. None of the detention of children will be resolved. None of the land confiscation, which, by the way, is not only happening in the West Bank, it's happening over the entire country. There is no more definition, West Bank or not West Bank. None of this can happen until apartheid falls and is replaced by democracy with equal rights, one person, one vote. Then these issues can be resolved. Until then, nothing can be resolved because Israel will not allow it. The Palestinian struggle for liberation is legal according to international law, is morally a right struggle, and it is not terrorism. It has many facets. Some of it is armed, some of it is unarmed. BDS is a big part of it today, like we heard earlier. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance has been unarmed, whereas the Israeli violence towards Palestinians for over 70 years has been nothing but terrorism. Now, when I talk about the Israeli military, when I talk about Zionism, I didn't learn about this in Sunday school. I learned about this at home. My father fought in 48 and was a general in 67. My grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. On Saturdays, we used to go have lunch at the president's mansion. I heard these people talk. I know how they think. I know what they want. I know how they react to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are filth and they want them to die. This is our land. That's the bottom line. That's what Zionism is about. And it doesn't matter if it was Netanyahu or Ben-Gurion or anybody in between. They never wanted peace. They never wanted the Arabs. They tried to kick them out, and they continue to try to kick them out. And I'm telling you this, not because I read it in a book, not because I read Ilan Pape, because I was there sitting and hearing these people talk. I was there and I know how they thought. And then I saw my father part away from this. So I think it's crucially important. There is violence. Of course there's Palestinian violence. But it's not terrorism. It's a fight for justice and freedom. And when Israel will lay down its weapons and allow for real Palestinian rights, for justice, the end of the Zionist regime, then Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace in a democratic state, which will not be the Zionist state of Israel. That is the bottom line.